morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today's part will be devoted mostly to the Pre-Raphaelites. This is the title of the Moodle presentation that you can find. But before we start talking about the Pre-Raphaelite painters, I would like to draw your attention to another aspect of 19th century art, namely architecture, and especially the phenomenon in British culture, which was called the Battle of the Styles. This was mostly about architecture. This was concerned with the discussions. They were aesthetic discussions, but other aspects were added to the aesthetic questions. Even moral aspects were added between two styles that were dominant in public buildings in the 19th century. That is the neoclassical style and the neo-Gothic style. So the battle of the styles was mostly the proponents of the neo-Gothic style arguing that their favorite style is better and indeed more moral than the neoclassical style, which used to be popular a generation or two generations earlier. If you think of such buildings as the British Museum, this was built in the neoclassical style, but at the beginning or in the first decades of the 19th century, a new style, the neo-Gothic style, started gaining popularity. And why would it be seen as more appropriate or even more moral than the neoclassical style? And for this I would like you to see two illustrations from the book written by a very important architect of the early part of the first half, definitely, of the 19th century, Augustus Pugin. He had more names, but he normally goes by Augustus Pugin. I'll give you the link to a documentary about him called God's Own Architect, and it basically tells you everything. He believed that the Gothic style, which he wanted to revive, was better because it was more Christian, because it was referring to the Middle Ages, and for him and many other Victorians, the Middle Ages were the time which started to be idealized. So if we look at Pugin's book, which was entitled Contrasts, here we have two illustrations, two images comparing two aspects of life. The first one shows cities, the second one shows the institutions that are supposed to care for the poor. And if you look at the cities, the first image shows you the modern, which is neoclassical city, which is ugly and dehumanizing. There is a church in the foreground, but it doesn't even look spiritual. And below that, there is the idealized vision of the Middle Ages, where everyone knew how the world operated, everybody knew their place, and everybody basically was happier, at least according to Pugin. It's even more visible in the care for the poor illustrations. The upper part shows Pugin's vision of one of the most notorious Victorian institutions, that is the workhouse, which looks more like a prison than a shelter for the destitute. You can see the caretaker here looking like a jailer with the instruments of oppression. The diet of the poor being very meager and almost starvation diet. And the last image shows the fate of the poor after that they die. They are actually taken here to be dissected by the medical students, so their bodies are not buried, their bodies are just sold to medical students for practice. This is of course contrasted with the idealized Middle Ages, the beautiful almshouse as they were built in the Middle Ages, when everybody had their small garden, everybody was a brother in some sort of religious brotherhood, not exactly a monastery, but a religious brotherhood. There was no way of correction other than communal prayer. The food was healthy and plentiful, and when the poor brother died, he was interred with all the ceremony and religious practice. So that was one important argument for Pugin, that the Gothic style, the true medieval style, was more Christian. It actually communicated all the spiritual virtues of Christianity. Another argument was that it was the northern style, that the classical style, going back all the way to pagan Greece and Rome, were from the Mediterranean region. They were southern, they were from a completely different climate, from a completely different society. And the Gothic style originated in the north of Europe, in Germany, in France. So when it was adapted in Britain, it was the native style, the style that Britain shared with other Western and Northern European nations. So that was the argument. And here you can see below some examples of Pugin's churches. He designed a number of churches, mostly in relatively poor areas, like St. Giles Church in Cheadle, in a very poor industrial area, Staffordshire, if I remember correctly. This church looks almost like it was taken straight from the Middle Ages, but it's better than any village church that would be built in the Middle Ages. So it's colorful, it uses all the decorations that were known then, like colorful tapestries and stained glass and wood carving and brightly colored paintings. You can see some elements of those decorations in the picture. Another realization is St. Mary's and All Saints Church in Chesterfield. Another realization in the Neo-Gothic style, which looks better than the real Middle Ages. Look at this spiral spire. Something like this could not be built in the real Middle Ages, but now with 19th century technology and engineering, it very well could. So when we have sometimes in popular culture a certain idealization of the Victorian era, which is supposed to be beautiful and romantic, and people were more polite, and the manners were better, and the clothes were better, and there were all kinds of exciting things like, I don't know, mad scientists and vampires. The Victorians had exactly the same thing about the medieval period. It was everything plus the dragons. So they idealized the medieval period for its historicity and for the Christian spirituality, but they also built a fantasy around it. So and they felt very good about themselves doing that. It was Christian, it was native, northern, it was historical, so it was well grounded in the past. So if you remember when we talked about Turner and the Great Fire of Westminster Palace, of the old Houses of Parliament, which Turner rushed to see and sketch. Of course, later in the 19th century, the Houses of Parliament were being rebuilt, and there was a massive public discussion which style should be used for that. And of course, the Neo-Gothic style prevailed. Or to be more precise, it was a classical grid. It was a rather regular floor plan with Neo-Gothic decorations. And Augustus Pugin was among some other artists involved in the reconstruction of Westminster Palace. So what we see now in London is really his work and his vision of the idealized Middle Ages, of the building that is basically modern, 19th century modern, but it's made deliberately to look much older than it was, to link with the British past, to link with Christian values, and so on. And if we look at the Victorian public buildings, you'll find a lot of examples of this idealized neo-medievalism. Another example here is the Manchester Town Hall, a huge construction in the center of the big industrial city with no long history, but the new town hall was deliberately designed to look much older, to look like a Gothic cathedral, but in fact it was a very modern cathedral to commerce and science and modern industry. So this is really the background for the Victorian art. This is the background against which such breakaway groups as the Pre-Raphaelites started to develop. So we continue in a moment.